I did not start doubting my marriage because of a secret affair. It began with a simple, polite question in a hospital hallway. My former obstetrician smiled and asked, "How is your daughter?" My blood ran cold. For 9 years, I firmly believed I had given birth to a son. By midnight, an altered medical record, a hidden woman, and a little girl my boy desperately wanted to destroy blew open a nearly decade-old crime. My name is Madeline Knight. I make a living anticipating disasters before they strike. As a senior risk analyst at the Halcyon Beacon Group, my days are spent measuring the exact weight of collateral damage, looking for the hidden fractures in corporate structures before the whole building collapses. I am paid to be unsentimental, to read the data, and to never let emotion cloud my judgment. On a typical Tuesday afternoon, I was deep into a complex merger file, calculating the potential fallout of a $75 million liability, when my private line rang. The caller ID flashed Briargate Academy. Briargate was the kind of elite private institution where tuition cost more than what most families earned in 3 years combined. Phone calls from the administration in the middle of the school day rarely meant anything good. They meant someone was bleeding, or someone was preparing to sue. I answered on the second ring. The voice on the other end belonged to Headmaster Sterling, crisp, tense, and entirely devoid of his usual manufactured warmth. He needed me on campus immediately. My 9-year-old son, Parker Sloan, was involved in a severe incident at the annual science exposition. I drove the 14 miles to the campus, gripping the leather steering wheel tight enough to turn my knuckles entirely white. The sprawling, manicured lawns of Briargate looked hostile under the gray afternoon sky. When I stepped into the mahogany-paneled administrative suite, the tension in the room was thick enough to choke on. I fully expected to find Parker in tears, terrified of the consequences. Instead, I found him sitting perfectly still in a high-backed leather wing chair. His legs were crossed comfortably at the ankles. He wore an expression of profound, bored detachment on his flawless face. Across the room stood a girl. She was small, swimming in a faded winter sweater, wearing scuffed sneakers, and holding a posture wound tighter than a steel spring. Her hands were clenched into tight fists at her sides, her knuckles bruised. Headmaster Sterling cleared his throat, adjusting his silk tie. He explained, his voice tight with controlled anger, that Parker had deliberately shoved a heavy display table. He had completely shattered a complex hydraulic bridge model built by the girl, Rowan Lane. Rowan was a full scholarship student. Parker had not only destroyed over 4 weeks of her hard work in a matter of seconds, but he had immediately turned to the nearest teacher, pointed his finger, and loudly claimed Rowan had tripped over her own clumsy feet and pulled the table down herself. I looked directly at my son. "Is this true?" Parker did not flinch. He did not look away. He adjusted the lapel of his pristine navy blazer and looked at me with chilling indifference. "She overreacted, Mother. It was a complete accident. Besides, she does not even know her place here. She should not be in our exhibition." The words hit me like a physical blow to the chest. The sheer, unadulterated arrogance was suffocating. Headmaster Sterling sighed heavily, removing his wire-rimmed glasses. He informed me that this was sadly not an isolated incident. Parker had been systematically targeting Rowan for the past 6 months. He had openly mocked her thrift store clothing. He had expertly manipulated the parent and student digital group chats, spreading vicious rumors about her family's financial status, effectively turning the entire 4th grade social hierarchy against her. He was orchestrating her complete isolation with the ruthless precision of a seasoned politician. But Rowan was clearly not a fragile, weeping victim. Sterling explained the escalation today happened because Parker had tried to frame a much younger, terrified 1st-grade student for knocking over a glass beaker of chemical dye. Rowan had stepped right into the line of fire. She had positioned her own small body between Parker and the crying child, absolutely refusing to back down. She fought back fiercely, calling Parker out on his malicious lies in front of the entire faculty, in brutal retaliation for her defiance. Parker had walked over and destroyed her project. I stared at Parker, desperately searching for a tiny trace of remorse. There was absolutely none. Instead, I saw a terrifying, undeniable reflection. The slight, condescending tilt of his head. The soft, infinitely reasonable cadence of his voice when he lied. The subtle smirk that suggested everyone else in the room was simply too emotional to understand the logical facts. He was a flawless, miniature replica of my husband, Everett Sloane. Everett was an absolute master of the elegant gaslight. He was a man who could calmly explain why your pain was actually your own fault, doing it with such a gentle, soothing tone that you ended up apologizing to him for being upset. Parker was using the exact same playbook. He was only 9 years old, and he was already weaponizing his wealth and privilege with terrifying skill. I signed the temporary suspension paperwork without saying another word. I wrote a blank check for the damaged property and handed it to Sterling, though I knew deep down that money would not fix the raw humiliation radiating from Rowan Lane's sharp, guarded gray eyes. When I turned and tried to offer a sincere apology to her, she just looked right through me. The walk across the parking lot to the car was dead silent until the heavy doors locked. Then, Parker dropped the polite, public facade. He slumped dramatically in the expensive leather seat and glared at me. "Dad would not handle this like you." Parker sneered, his high voice dripping with unexpected venom. "Dad understands how things actually work in the real world. You are just cold. You do not even care about my side of the story. You are completely emotionless." I gripped the steering wheel, keeping my eyes straight ahead. "You destroyed another student's hard work. Parker, you lied to the teachers. There are real consequences for cruelty." He twisted violently in his seat, throwing his arms up in a dramatic display of manufactured frustration. "It is not a big deal. You are the one making it a big deal just to punish me." As he slammed his right hand against the hard plastic door panel in a sudden tantrum, he let out a sharp, genuine cry of shock. He grabbed his right wrist, his face finally twisting into real, childlike pain. During the chaotic scuffle at the science fair, he must have sprained it, and hitting the heavy door had severely exacerbated the hidden injury. It was swelling fast, turning an ugly shade of purple. I immediately abandoned the planned route home and navigated the SUV toward the nearest emergency medical facility. We ended up at the St. Bridget Women's Pavilion and Urgent Care Center. It was a sprawling, modern brick complex, and it was the very same hospital where I had delivered Parker 9 years ago. The urgent care waiting room was a chaotic, depressing mix of buzzing fluorescent lights and the sharp, chemical smell of industrial antiseptic. After 45 minutes of tense waiting, a triage nurse finally wrapped Parker's swollen wrist in a temporary blue splint and sent us down a long, echoing corridor toward the radiology department for a comprehensive bone X-ray. I was walking slightly ahead of Parker, carrying our coats, my mind still racing violently with the terrifying realization of exactly who my son was becoming, when I heard a familiar voice cut through the hospital noise. "Madeline, Madeline Knight." I stopped dead in my tracks and turned around. Stepping out of a staff elevator was Dr. Celia Marrow. She was older now, her previously dark hair now completely silver, but her warm, incredibly intelligent eyes were exactly as I remembered them. She had been my primary obstetrician. She was the brilliant woman who had guided me through a terrifying, high-risk pregnancy and an emergency surgical delivery that nearly killed me. I forced a polite, practiced smile onto my face, shifting my heavy leather purse to my other shoulder. "Dr. Marrow, it is so genuinely good to see you. It has been a very long time." She beamed brightly, walking over to warmly clasp both of my hands in hers. "It certainly has been. Goodness, it feels like an entire lifetime ago since that crazy weekend we rushed you into the operating room. I am so glad to see you looking so healthy and well." Her eyes crinkled at the corners in genuine affection. Then, she tilted her head slightly, her warm smile widening as she asked the simple, polite question that would tear my entire reality apart. "Tell me," Dr. Marrow said, her kind voice echoing slightly against the polished linoleum floors, "how is your daughter doing now?" The air in the hospital corridor seemed to instantly vanish. My lungs stopped working. The ambient noise of paging systems, squeaking rubber soles, and distant conversations muted into a low, rushing hum inside my ears. I stood perfectly still, my hand gripping the strap of my heavy leather purse so tightly, my fingernails bit into my own palm. I stared at Dr. Celia Marrow. I waited for the punchline, for the gentle correction, for the moment she would tap her forehead and laugh at her own mistake. It did not happen. Her warm, expectant smile remained fixed on her face, waiting for my answer. I forced air past my teeth. Dr. Marrow, I had a boy. Parker, you delivered my son. The smile slipped off her face entirely. It was replaced by a look of sheer, unadulterated clinical confusion. She tilted her head, her brow furrowing deep with wrinkles. Madeline, no, that is not right. I remember your delivery vividly. It is not the kind of case a physician forgets. It has been 9 years, I countered, my voice sounding incredibly thin, almost metallic, in the echoing hallway. You see hundreds of patients, thousands. I see thousands of routine births, she corrected me, her tone shifting from friendly to firmly professional. You were not routine. You presented with sudden, severe preeclampsia. Your blood pressure spiked to 210/120. You were seizing when the paramedics wheeled you through those exact double doors. We performed an emergency vertical incision because there was absolutely no time for a transverse cut. We had to get the baby out to save your life. I swallowed hard. My throat felt like it was lined with shattered glass. Yes, I know. It was traumatic, but I gave birth to a boy. Dr. Marrow took a half step closer to me. She lowered her voice, not out of secrecy, but with the quiet authority of a medical professional stating an empirical fact. Madeline, I pulled a female infant from your uterus. She was small due to the early delivery, weighing just 5 pounds and 4 ounces. But her APGAR scores were remarkable. She came out screaming. She was a fighter. I personally signed the birth certificate and the initial operative report. I do not mistake the biological sex of an infant I pull from a mother's body. My mind violently rejected the information. It was a physical revulsion. I shook my head, my carefully styled hair falling into my eyes. That is impossible. Everett told me there were complications. He told me our son had underdeveloped lungs. Parker spent 4 days in the neonatal intensive care unit. You must be confusing the post-operative care. Everett handled all the paperwork while I was heavily medicated on the magnesium drip. A boy with underdeveloped lungs. Dr. Marrow repeated the words slowly, rolling them around in her mouth as if tasting poison. Madeline, the baby girl I delivered did not need intubation. She did not spend 4 days in the intensive care unit. She was placed in a standard warming bassinet. Before I could form another word, before I could demand she pull the archival medical files this exact second, the heavy wooden door of the radiology suite swung open. Parker stomped out into the hallway. He was scowling, cradling his wrist in the bright blue splint. He did not look like a vulnerable child in a hospital. He looked like a wealthy executive inconvenienced by a delayed flight. They are completely incompetent in there, he announced loudly, his sharp voice cutting through the heavy tension between Dr. Marrow and me. The technician took forever, and the fiberglass wrap is itching my skin. I want to go home right now. Dr. Marrow turned her head slowly. She looked at the boy standing next to me. She looked at his pale blonde hair, his sharp jawline, his demanding posture. She looked at him for a very long time. I watched the physician's eyes scan his features, searching for the genetic echoes of the woman standing beside him. When she finally turned her gaze back to me, the friendly obstetrician was gone. In her place was a woman deeply, profoundly alarmed. She did not say another word about the past. She simply looked at me with a chilling mixture of pity and terror. "Take care of yourself, Madeline," she whispered softly. Then, she turned and walked quickly down the hall, disappearing around the corner. The drive back to our sprawling suburban estate was a blur of gray asphalt and flashing brake lights. Parker sat in the passenger seat, aggressively tapping his good hand against the dashboard, complaining about the ruined science fair and the hospital staff. I did not hear a single word he said. My brain, trained to meticulously analyze risk and uncover corporate deception, was ripping through my own memories. The protective seal over the trauma of my delivery day was torn away. Flashes of disconnected images assaulted me, the blinding white surgical lights, the terrifying numbness spreading up my chest, the suffocating fog of heavy narcotics, and then Everett. Everett sitting in the dimly lit recovery room, Everett leaning over my bed, his face entirely in shadows, smelling faintly of expensive cologne and sterile alcohol. He was holding a swaddled bundle, but holding it strangely far away from me. I remembered reaching out, my arms feeling like they were made of solid lead. Do not touch him too much, Maddie. Everett's smooth, calming voice echoed in my memory. He is so fragile. His breathing is labored. Let the nurses do their jobs. You just need to sleep. Let me handle everything. I have it all under control. I had believed him. I had trusted my husband implicitly. Why would a mother question the child placed in her arms when she wakes up from the brink of death? I pulled the car onto the interstate and activated the hands-free calling system on the dashboard. I dialed Everett's private mobile number. He answered on the first ring, his voice rich and perfectly modulated. Maddie, I saw the charge from Briargate. I assume you handled the situation with Parker. I handled it, I said. I kept my voice entirely flat, stripping it of any emotional resonance. I sounded exactly like I did in the boardroom when presenting a quarterly loss. He threw a tantrum and sprained his wrist. I had to take him to St. Brigid for an x-ray. St. Brigid? Everett asked. There was a microscopic shift in his tone, a slight tightening. Why there? The private orthopedic clinic in the city is much better. It was the closest urgent care, I replied smoothly. I kept my eyes fixed on the taillights of the semi-truck in front of me. It was actually quite a coincidence. I ran into Dr. Marrow in the hallway, my old obstetrician. Oh. It was a single syllable, but it hung in the air like a dropped weight. I pressed the gas pedal down slightly. Yes, we had a brief chat. It was very strange. Everett. She asked me how our daughter was doing. Silence. In my profession, silence is data. When you confront a chief financial officer with a discrepancy in the offshore accounts, you count the seconds of their silence. 1 second is surprise. 2 seconds is confusion. 3 seconds is calculation. 4 seconds is guilt. The silence stretching across the cellular connection lasted exactly 5 seconds. She is an old woman. Maddie, Everett finally said. He spoke too fast. The elegant cadence was entirely gone, replaced by a rushed, defensive clip. She must be what? Pushing 70 now. She handles thousands of cases. She is clearly losing her cognitive edge, confusing you with another patient from a decade ago. She specifically remembered the preeclampsia, I noted softly. It is a common complication, Everett snapped. It was the first time I had heard him lose his temper in over 6 months. Look, I have a massive structural meeting with the board in 10 minutes. The legacy trust is being finalized this week, and I cannot be distracted by the rambling nonsense of a geriatric doctor. Give Parker his pain medication and put him to bed. I will be home late. He disconnected the call before I could say goodbye. I drove the rest of the way home in total silence. I pulled into our grand, circular driveway, parked the heavy vehicle, and walked my son into the house. I gave him 2 pediatric ibuprofen tablets, poured him a glass of iced water, and sent him to his bedroom. I did not go to my own bedroom. I did not fall onto the mattress and weep. I did not scream into a pillow or shatter a mirror. Panic and grief are useless currencies. They do not buy you the truth. I walked down the long carpeted hallway to my private home office. I stepped inside and closed the heavy oak door. I turned the brass lock until it clicked solidly into place. I walked over to the tall windows and pulled the thick blackout curtains tightly shut. plunging the room into shadows before turning on the single brass desk lamp. In the corner of the room stood a row of steel filing cabinets. I kept meticulous records of everything: tax returns, property deeds, medical history. I pulled the heavy drawer labeled with the year of Parker's birth. I dragged out a massive cardboard storage box filled with medical bills, insurance claims, and hospital discharge papers. I dumped the contents onto the center of my large mahogany desk. Dust motes danced in the harsh circle of yellow light. I rolled up the sleeves of my silk blouse. I was no longer a mother worried about a strange encounter. I was a senior risk analyst, and I had just discovered a massive, catastrophic discrepancy in the ledger of my own life. I was going to tear every single number, every single signature, and every single lie apart until I found the bottom of the fraud. I spread the contents of the heavy cardboard storage box across the smooth mahogany surface of my desk. The first 2 hours were pure, mechanical sorting. Insurance claims went into one pile. Itemized hospital bills formed another. Prenatal checkup summaries created a third. I was no longer a mother searching for comfort. I was a forensic auditor dissecting a hostile corporate takeover. I was looking for the structural weaknesses in the narrative my husband had built. I picked up the thick manila folder labeled with the dates of my second trimester. Inside was the detailed diagnostic report from my 20-week anatomy scan. I scanned past the dense medical jargon, ignoring the measurements of femurs and cranial circumference. Then, at the very bottom of the second page, in the small section reserved for the ultrasound technician's personal notes, I found the first explosive charge. It was just 4 words typed in a standard, unfeeling font. Healthy female fetus observed. A memory fought its way to the surface of my mind, sharp and sudden. I was standing in a high-end baby boutique on Walnut Street, tracing my swollen fingers over luxurious swatches of cream and sage green fabric. I had picked out a name: Clara. I had ordered custom monogrammed blankets and specialized wall decals. When the expensive delivery box arrived at our house weeks later, the blankets inside were stark navy blue, entirely devoid of any initials or feminine touches. Everett had smoothly intervened, shaking his head with an exasperated, loving sigh. The store completely botched the custom order. Maddie, they printed the wrong registry details and mixed up our account. I already handled the return and got these instead. Do not stress yourself out over it. I had been too exhausted, too physically drained from the high blood pressure, to fight him on a retail mistake. I had simply accepted his reality over my own intuition. I pushed the ultrasound report aside and moved to the towering stack of hospital discharge paperwork. As a senior risk analyst, my eyes are professionally trained to catch microscopic visual anomalies in legal contracts. A slight shift in margin alignment, a different font weight, a break in the chronological chain of custody. I held the yellow carbon copy of the infant release form directly under the harsh, unforgiving glow of the brass desk lamp. The primary patient information regarding my surgical recovery was filled out in a fluid, black gel pen. The handwriting was neat and consistent, but the section detailing the infant was completely different. The ink was blue, likely from a cheap, disposable ballpoint pen. The physical pressure of the handwriting was significantly heavier, pressing deep grooves into the thin paper. The gender box was checked male, but the check mark extended awkwardly and violently outside the printed lines, as if executed in a massive, panicked hurry. The baby's birth weight and length were squeezed into the narrow margins, completely out of alignment with the original text fields. It was a sloppy, frantic, manual addition made long after the main document was officially signed and sealed. Then, I found the fatal flaw. It was buried deep within a secondary stack of out-of-pocket expense receipts that Everett had meticulously submitted to our private health savings account for tax deduction purposes. It was a small, faded square of thermal paper, a parking garage receipt from the hospital's valet service, time-stamped at 2 a.m. on the exact night I was rushed into emergency surgery. The charge was for $35, but the last 4 digits of the credit card printed on the slip did not belong to any financial account we jointly or individually owned. and the name printed clearly on the payment authorization line was Darla Voss. Darla. The name tasted like battery acid in my mouth. Years ago, before we were even engaged, Everett had casually mentioned a woman named Darla. He had painted her as a clingy, desperate ex-girlfriend from his early college days. He had firmly assured me she had moved away to Oregon, chasing some failed startup dream, completely erased from his life and his social circles. I opened my secure, encrypted work laptop. I entirely bypassed the standard commercial search engines and logged directly into a proprietary skip tracing database my firm used for deep background checks on corporate executives. I typed her full name into the search bar and hit the enter key. The system took less than 10 seconds to return a comprehensive, undeniable hit. Darla Voss had never moved to Oregon. She had never even left the state of Pennsylvania. She had a currently registered residential address in a quiet, deeply affluent suburb of Philadelphia, a mere 40-minute drive from the chair I was currently sitting in. I picked up my mobile phone and dialed a private number I had not used in over 4 years. Nolan Pike answered on the third ring. Nolan was a former hospital compliance investigator who had left the sterile corporate world to run a highly discreet, ruthlessly efficient private intelligence firm. He was cynical, sharp, and prohibitively expensive. "Madeline," Nolan said, his voice a low, rough gravel rasp over the cellular connection. "It is past midnight. Who is threatening to sue your firm?" "I need to hire you personally. Nolan, completely off the books. Zero connection to Halcyon Beacon. I am listening. I have 3 specific targets," I instructed him, keeping my voice perfectly steady and utterly devoid of emotion. "First, I need a complete, invasive background workup on a woman named Darla Voss. I want her current address, her financial standing, her employment history, and her vehicle registrations. Second, I need you to pull the archived, unredacted birth records from St. Bridget Women's Pavilion for the weekend of the 12th of October, 9 years ago. I do not care who you have to bribe, blackmail, or hack to get past their digital firewall. Get me the raw, original data. Third, I want full, round-the-clock, aggressive surveillance on my husband, Everett Sloan. Track his primary vehicle, monitor his secondary burner phones, and audit his private credit cards. I want to know absolutely everywhere he goes and every single person he speaks to." Nolan did not ask for a reason. He did not offer useless sympathy. He merely quoted a massive retainer fee of $25,000. I told him the money would be wired into his untraceable offshore account before the sun came up. I hung up the phone. The sprawling house was dead quiet, save for the low hum of the central air conditioning. I left my office, my bare feet making absolutely no sound on the thick hardwood floors, and walked slowly down the dark hallway toward Parker's bedroom. I gently pushed his heavy bedroom door open. The boy was fast asleep, his injured arm resting carefully on a silk pillow. His silver smartphone was plugged into the charging cable on his nightstand. I walked over and picked it up. I knew his passcode. It was the exact day and month of Everett's birthday. The illuminated screen unlocked instantly in my hand. I bypassed his mobile games, his internet browser, and his group text messages. I went straight into his photo application. I knew how to look for hidden digital albums. Children always think they are clever with digital folders, but they always leave a traceable footprint. I scrolled rapidly through hundreds of mundane images, screenshots of video games, pictures of expensive sneakers, short videos of our purebred dog. Then, buried incredibly deep within a locked folder, labeled only with a single smiling face emoji, I found a massive cache of photographs featuring a blonde woman. Parker had her contact information saved simply as Aunt D. I opened the most recent photograph in the hidden gallery. It was a candid shot taken at an indoor miniature golf course. Parker was standing proudly in the foreground, holding a neon green putter, looking slightly annoyed at the camera lens. But behind him, slightly out of focus in the background, was Darla Voss. She was not looking at the camera. She was looking directly at Parker. I used my thumb and index finger to zoom in closely on her face. my breath catching painfully hard in my throat. It was not the polite, distant gaze of an aunt or a casual family friend. It was a look of pure, unguarded, consuming devotion. Her eyes were slightly crinkled at the corners, her physical posture leaning unconsciously toward the boy, as if an invisible, unbreakable tether was pulling her directly to him. I recognized that specific look instantly. I knew that exact expression because I had seen it reflected in my own bathroom mirror every single day for the past 9 years. It was the fierce, undeniable, territorial look of a mother staring at her own flesh and blood. The final piece of the puzzle snapped into place with a sickening crunch. The truth settled deep into my bones, freezing my blood from the inside out. My husband had not just lied about a tragic medical complication. He had executed a flawless masterclass in human trafficking, and he had hidden the evidence right inside my own marriage. The encrypted messaging application on my secure laptop chimed precisely at 6 o'clock in the morning. I had not slept a single minute. My eyes were burning, but my mind was operating with the cold, frictionless efficiency of a machine. Nolan Pike did not bother with pleasantries. He initiated a secure audio link and immediately began transferring heavily encrypted document files directly to my local drive. "You were entirely right about the timeline." Nolan's gravelly voice filled the quiet space of my office. Darla Voss was admitted to St. Bridget on the exact same Friday night you were rushed into the surgical ward. She checked into the maternity wing just 3 floors above you. However, she did not use the surname Voss. She registered under her mother's maiden name, Darla Vance. She paid her initial admission deposit entirely in cash. I clicked open the first document. It was a scanned copy of a nurse's intake chart. "What did she deliver?" "A boy," Nolan stated flatly. 8 pounds, 2 ounces. "Perfectly healthy. But here is where the paperwork turns into a massive, glaring liability. By Sunday morning, the infant's legal status was abruptly amended in the hospital's internal database. It was flagged as a private relinquishment and transfer. There is no official state adoption agency listed. No foster care intake. The baby just legally vanished from her room, absorbed into a secondary set of completely fabricated discharge documents. I pulled up the visitor logs Nolan had extracted from the hospital's obsolete security servers. I highlighted a recurring string of data points. "Look at the timestamps. Nolan, look at Everett." "I saw it," he confirmed. "Your husband was running a marathon between floors that entire weekend." He logged into the neonatal ward, your intensive care unit, and Darla's private suite a total of 17 times over 48 hours. The parking garage cameras captured him carrying a single infant car seat out of the east exit at 4 in the morning on Monday. He was not alone. Darla was walking right beside him. The sheer logistical audacity of it was suffocating. I opened the next file. It was a sprawling spreadsheet detailing complex financial wire transfers. "Everett has been funding a shadow life," Nolan continued, the rhythmic tapping of his keyboard echoing over the line. "I traced a network of dummy limited liability corporations back to a blind trust your husband controls. For the past 9 years, he has paid the monthly lease on Darla's 4-bedroom suburban house. He covers her luxury vehicle payments, her groceries, and her private health insurance. He is effectively keeping her on a permanent, 6-figure annual payroll." I stared at the rows of numbers. My husband was bleeding our marital assets to maintain the biological mother of the child sleeping down the hall. But then Nolan sent the final document, and the temperature in my office plummeted. "Open the file named Surrender," Nolan instructed. It was a standard state-issued form for the voluntary termination of parental rights. My full legal name was printed at the top. Below the dense legal paragraphs was my signature. I scrutinized the ink strokes. As an analyst who spent years dissecting fraudulent corporate contracts, I could spot a forgery from across a boardroom. The loops on the letter M were entirely too rigid. The heavy pressure at the end of the letter T indicated hesitation. It was a meticulous tracing job, likely lifted from our joint mortgage application. Everett had forged my signature to legally abandon my biological daughter to the state. paving the way for the private transfer of Darla's son into our custody. There is a structural motive here, I said, my voice dropping to a harsh whisper. Everett is a narcissist, but he is a calculated one. He would not orchestrate a federal crime of this magnitude solely out of a misplaced sense of romantic loyalty to an ex-girlfriend. This is a high-risk operation. There has to be a massive financial incentive. You hit the nail on the head, Nolan replied. I ran a deep sweep on the Sloan family corporate structure. Your father-in-law, Conrad Sloan, is preparing to step down. He is establishing a generational legacy trust worth upwards of $80 million. The primary stipulation for the managing director position, the proxy package heavily favors the heir who provides the first male grandson to carry the Sloan name into the next century. A daughter would have secured you a nice trust fund, but a son gives Everett absolute, uncontested control over the entire dynasty. I terminated the connection. The room spun slightly. This was never a crime of passion. It was a bloodline fraud. Everett needed a male heir to secure his corporate empire, and my body had failed to produce the required asset. So, he simply purchased a replacement and discarded my daughter like a defective piece of merchandise. I left my office and walked into the bright, sunlit kitchen. Parker was sitting at the marble island, awkwardly trying to eat a bowl of expensive organic cereal with his left hand. The blue splint on his right wrist rested heavily on the countertop. I poured myself a cup of black coffee and leaned against the sink, watching the boy. He had Everett's calculating eyes, but the soft curve of his jaw was entirely Darla. Your wrist looks painful, I noted smoothly, keeping my tone perfectly casual. We might need to cancel your weekend plans. Parker scowled, dropping his silver spoon into the ceramic bowl with a loud clatter. I cannot cancel. Dad promised he would take me to see Aunt Darla. We go every single month. Sometimes we stay the entire weekend when you are away on your business trips. The casual admission hit me like a physical strike. Everett had not just kept Darla on the payroll, he had integrated her deeply into Parker's life under a meticulously crafted alias. Aunt Darla, I repeated, tasting the poison of the name. I do not think I have ever properly met her. Dad says she's an old friend from college. She is great, Parker stated, a rare flicker of genuine warmth crossing his usually guarded face. She has a massive backyard. We play with her golden retriever, Baxter. She always bakes this incredible lemon glaze cake from scratch just for me. You never bake. I took a slow sip of my burning coffee. It sounds like you two are quite close. Parker looked up at me, his gaze hardening with a sudden, defensive defiance. He crossed his uninjured arm over his chest. She actually listens to me. When I told her about the science fair yesterday, she did not yell at me or make me feel like a failure. She said I was just asserting my natural leadership skills. She understands me completely. She understands me way better than you do. The words hung in the sterile air of the kitchen. He meant it as an insult, a childish jab designed to hurt my feelings. But it was simply the objective truth. Darla understood him because she had built him from her own DNA. She was validating his cruelty because it mirrored the exact ruthlessness she and Everett had used to orchestrate this entire life. I smiled at him. It was a cold, terrifyingly calm smile. I am sure she does understand you. Parker, I am absolutely sure of it. I turned my back to him and placed my coffee cup into the stainless steel sink. The initial shock had entirely evaporated, replaced by a crystalline, hyper-focused rage. Everett thought he had engineered the perfect corporate maneuver. He believed he could use my pristine credit, my clean social standing, and my profound grief to mask his hostile takeover of the Sloan family fortune. He had treated my womb like a temporary storage unit and my life like a disposable shell company. But Everett had made one catastrophic miscalculation. He had underestimated the precise, ruinous capabilities of a senior risk analyst who suddenly realizes her entire portfolio is built on a lie. I was not going to simply file for a messy divorce or cry in a courtroom. I was going to systematically dismantle his $80 million legacy, brick by bloody brick, until there was absolutely nothing left but ash. I navigated my vehicle away from the manicured, tree-lined suburbs and drove deep into the forgotten industrial grid of the city. Harbor House Youth Cooperative sat on a bleak corner lot surrounded by rusted chain-link fences and cracked concrete sidewalks. It was a universe away from the velvet lawns and mahogany halls of Briargate Academy. I walked through the heavy metal security doors under the formal guise of offering apologies and structural support, following the disastrous science fair incident. The facility director, a perpetually exhausted woman named Sarah, met me in the cramped lobby. She led me down a narrow corridor that smelled sharply of industrial floor cleaner and boiled institutional food. Before we reached the communal recreation room, Sarah paused. She leaned against the cinder block wall and lowered her voice, offering me the unsolicited background file on the girl I was about to see. She explained that Rowan had not simply fallen into the foster system due to a recent tragedy. She had been born into its absolute lowest margins. Rowan had bounced through a chaotic string of emergency group homes because a highly secretive private placement had mysteriously collapsed right after her birth. Sarah shook her head, her expression tight with frustration. She told me that Rowan's earliest medical files and state intake documents were riddled with massive, inexplicable gaps. There were missing caseworker signatures, completely blank timeline dates, and zero identifying markers of her biological origins. The state bureaucracy simply swallowed the clerical errors and moved the infant along, labeling her as an abandoned ward. I absorbed the data, my heart hammering a slow, heavy rhythm against my ribs. I stepped into the noisy recreation room. Rowan was sitting entirely alone at a scuffed plastic folding table in the far corner. She was not crying over her destroyed bridge model. She was not seeking comfort from the overworked staff. She was hunched aggressively over a dismantled, cheap portable speaker, meticulously rewiring the tiny green circuit board with a precision screwdriver. I walked over to her. I did not approach with a hollow, weeping apology or a heavy white envelope stuffed with cash. Pity is a completely useless currency to a child who has never once possessed a safety net. Instead, I set a heavy canvas duffel bag down on the edge of her workspace. Inside was a professional-grade bicycle repair kit, complete with titanium wrenches, and 3 advanced technical manuals on mechanical engineering and structural load distribution. Rowan stopped working immediately. She did not eagerly reach for the bag. She slowly raised her head, her posture snapping instantly rigid. She scanned my face and my expensive wool coat like I was a live explosive device. Her eyes narrowed to small slits. She was calculating the angle, actively searching for the hidden trapdoor buried inside my sudden generosity. "I am not here to buy your silence or your forgiveness," I said. I kept my voice perfectly level, entirely stripped of any soothing maternal condescension. "I saw the hydraulic bridge model you built yesterday before it was ruined. It was structurally brilliant. You clearly understand tension and weight mechanics. I thought you might actually prefer real tools over a formal, meaningless letter of apology from the school board." She stared at me for 10 long seconds. Finally, she pulled the canvas bag toward her chest. She used her left hand. She unzipped the heavy metal zipper, her fingers moving with a fluid. Natural dexterity. Left-handed. I watched her small thumb trace the smooth edge of a steel wrench. I am also exclusively left-handed, a trait neither Everett nor Darla possessed. "Why are you actually here?" Rowan asked. Her voice was sharp, cutting through the room like a spool of steel wire. She did not possess the soft, eager compliance of an orphan desperate for adoption. She was guarded, relentlessly blunt, and fiercely independent. "Parents like you usually just write a massive check to the headmaster and pretend the poor scholarship kid does not even exist. I want to know how to fix what my son broke," I replied carefully, holding my ground. Rowan tilted her chin up. It was a microscopic, defensive gesture, a very specific way of jutting the jaw slightly forward when confronting a hostile variable. It was the exact same physical mechanism I used when a corporate lawyer attempted to lie to me during a high-stakes deposition. I felt the oxygen completely leave my lungs. I looked closely at her face under the harsh, buzzing fluorescent lights. Her eyes were not just standard gray, they were a distinct, storm cloud gray-blue, rimmed with a much darker ring of slate. They were the exact, undeniable replica of the eyes staring back at me in my own mirror every single morning. The shape of her brow, the slight arch of her nose. I was looking at a ghost. "You cannot fix it with tools," Rowan stated, her tone flat and uncompromising, snapping my attention back to her words. "And I absolutely do not need a new scholarship endowment or free cafeteria lunches. What I actually need is for Parker to stop using his father's bank account and his little group of pathetic followers to turn the entire school into his own personal power playground. He destroys things because he knows he will never once have to clean up the mess. That is what needs fixing." I stood entirely still, watching her pick up the tiny screwdriver again. She returned her attention to the broken speaker, her focus absolute and terrifyingly intense. She possessed a relentless internal drive, a sheer force of will that had clearly allowed her to survive nearly a decade of systemic neglect. She was a raw, unfiltered version of myself, forged in a brutal furnace of deprivation rather than a soft cradle of extreme privilege. She did not whine about unfairness. She calculated the structural flaws. She did not beg for help. She demanded basic accountability. My maternal intuition had already built the entire case, but my logical brain locked the heavy steel vault shut. The physical markers were not genetic coincidences. The missing early placement records were not administrative errors. They were the calculated, paper trail cover-up of a massive theft. I left Harbor House 30 minutes later. I walked back to my luxury vehicle with a terrifying, absolute clarity settling deep into my bones. As I merged my car onto the busy interstate highway, my dashboard communication console lit up. It was Nolan. I answered the call on the hands-free system. "Tell me you have a legal strategy ready to deploy." "I spoke with a very quiet contact inside the family court system," Nolan reported, his voice cutting clearly through the ambient road noise. "Because of the massive missing documentation in her original state file, and given your immediate status as a concerned corporate benefactor offering substantial financial backing to the cooperative, we can quietly petition the Harbor House administration. We can get them to authorize a legal, fully court-admissible genetic test. We will frame it as a strict requirement for a specialized medical trust fund we are supposedly setting up for her future. They will sign off on the paperwork by Friday morning." "Do it," I commanded without a single second of hesitation. "Expedite the laboratory fees. Pay whatever exorbitant premium is required for a guaranteed 48-hour turnaround time." "You are entirely certain about this, Madeline?" Nolan asked. It was a rare, genuine moment of hesitation from the deeply cynical investigator. "If this genetic sequence matches, it blows your entire current existence into a million unrecoverable pieces." "I do not need the laboratory results to believe the truth, Nolan. I already know exactly who she is. I need the certified legal document to publicly and permanently destroy Everett Sloan." I disconnected the line and gripped the leather steering wheel until my knuckles ached. The highway stretched out in front of me, a long gray ribbon cutting through the late afternoon sun. A brutal, sickening irony finally materialized in my mind, wrapping around my throat like a heavy iron chain. For nearly a full year, Everett and Darla's biological son had been systematically hunting down a vulnerable scholarship student. He had mocked her extreme poverty, deliberately destroyed her hard work, and orchestrated her public humiliation with gleeful, unchecked malice. The child who was currently sleeping in my luxurious home, eating at my expensive marble table, and casually spending my money was the exact same boy who had made it his personal mission to completely crush Rowan Lane. Parker was actively trying to destroy the very girl whose life he had stolen. He was tormenting my biological daughter. I did not cry. Crying was a biological response strictly reserved for victims. And I was entirely done being a victim. I felt a cold, absolute calm wash over my entire nervous system. Everett thought he had engineered a flawless corporate extraction. He thought he could manipulate human lives like moving numbers on a quarterly financial spreadsheet, but he had fundamentally misunderstood the nature of the woman he married. You do not steal the daughter of a senior risk analyst and expect to walk away with your legacy intact. I did not raise my voice when I initiated the lockdown protocol on my own home. Screaming is a complete waste of tactical energy. I simply changed the master wireless internet passwords and systematically removed every single electronic device from Parker's bedroom. I confiscated his silver smartphone, his high-end gaming console, and his portable tablet. When he returned from his mandatory suspension meeting at the academy, he expected to retreat into his digital echo chamber. Instead, I handed him a printed daily schedule. It included 0 screen time, restricted access to the property grounds, and a firm directive that he would sit at the kitchen island and handwrite a formal apology letter to the school board. Parker was completely livid. He stomped his feet, his face flushing a deep, angry red. He demanded to call his father. He threatened to run away. I simply poured myself a glass of iced water and watched him exhaust his limited emotional arsenal. When you strip away a bully's audience and their digital weapons, they are left with nothing but their own hollow noise. Later that evening, while Parker sulked in his silent room, I plugged his confiscated smartphone into my secure laptop, using a specialized data recovery program Nolan had provided. I bypassed the standard deleted folders and extracted a hidden thread of encrypted text messages between the boy and Everett. My husband had not been scolding his son for the horrific behavior at the science fair. He had been managing a public relations crisis. Everett's messages were short, sharp, and highly calculated. Keep your head down. One text read, "Do not cause any more problems with the scholarship kids. We just need to maintain the perfect family image until Legacy Weekend. After that, none of this will matter." Legacy Weekend. The phrase glowed menacingly on my digital screen. It was the annual, highly exclusive Sloan Family Summit held at their massive coastal estate in Georgia. In exactly 14 days, my father-in-law, Conrad Sloan, was scheduled to officially ratify the new generational trust documents. Everett was not just trying to avoid a scandal. He was trying to keep the fraudulent package perfectly wrapped until the ink dried on a multi-million-dollar inheritance contract. The next morning, the Cold War in the house escalated. Parker refused to eat the breakfast prepared by our private chef. He stood in the center of the pristine, marble kitchen, his uninjured hand curled into a tight fist. He tried to use his usual manipulation tactics, adopting the exact condescending tone his father always used. "You have absolutely no right to lock me down like a prisoner," Parker demanded, glaring at me. "Dad is going to be furious when he finds out what you are doing. You are just taking your own miserable attitude out on me." I did not flinch. I slowly wiped the granite countertop with a damp cloth. "Your father is not here, Parker, I am. And in this house, there are strict consequences for destroying other people's property and lying about it." When he realized his corporate posturing was failing to elicit a reaction, Parker resorted to pure, unfiltered cruelty. He crossed his arms over his chest, his eyes narrowing into cold little slits. He threw out the exact sentence he calculated would inflict the maximum amount of psychological damage. "You do not even love me anyway," Parker spat, his voice dropping an octave to mimic adult seriousness. "Aunt Darla is the one who actually wanted me. She told me so. You just tolerate me because Dad makes you." The air in the kitchen turned instantly to ice. I felt a violent shudder travel straight down my spine, but I forcefully locked my facial muscles into a mask of total indifference. He had absolutely no idea the magnitude of the truth he had just weaponized. He thought he was scoring a cheap emotional point against a strict mother. He did not realize he was quoting the exact motive of his own kidnapping. I set the cloth down. "Go to your room. Parker, do not come out until I tell you to." Once he stomped up the heavy wooden stairs, I pulled my mobile phone from my pocket and sent Everett a single, non-negotiable text message. "Come home immediately. We need to discuss the hospital paperwork from 9 years ago." Everett arrived exactly 45 minutes later. He strode through the heavy oak front doors. exuding his usual arrogant, effortless charm. He was wearing a bespoke navy suit, completely prepared to manage whatever hysterical emotional outburst he assumed I was having. I was sitting at the center of our massive dining table. I had placed my phone face down on the polished wood, the voice recording application already silently capturing every single sound in the room. I did not present the genetic testing plan. I did not mention the private investigator. I simply laid out 3 specific pieces of paper: the forged voluntary relinquishment form, the late-night valet parking receipt bearing Darla's name, and the heavily altered hospital discharge summary. Everett stopped at the edge of the table. His eyes scanned the documents. I watched the microscopic tightening of his jaw, the rapid calculation behind his smooth facade. He did not panic. Narcissists of his caliber never panic. They pivot. "What exactly is this supposed to be, Maddie?" Everett asked, his tone dripping with exhausted patience. He pulled out a heavy chair and sat down across from me. "Are you spending your afternoons digging through decades-old tax receipts now? Explain the signature on the surrender form." "Everett," I said quietly. My voice was completely devoid of anger. It was the absolute flat tone of an auditor presenting undeniable fraud. "Because I never signed it." Everett leaned back, crossing his legs casually. He shifted instantly into his masterclass of psychological manipulation. He softened his voice, looking at me with deep, manufactured pity. "Madeline, you were heavily medicated. You were suffering from severe preeclampsia and borderline eclampsia. You were hallucinating half the time. You do not remember signing the secondary insurance and administrative clearance forms because you were practically unconscious. And Darla Voss paying for parking at 2 a.m. I pressed, tapping the small thermal receipt. He let out a short, dismissive laugh. "She was in the city visiting friends. She heard about your emergency surgery from a mutual acquaintance and stopped by to drop off flowers. I sent her away immediately. You are taking entirely unrelated clerical debris and trying to build a conspiracy out of it." He leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table, invading my physical space with his intense gaze. "Let us be brutally honest here. Maddie, you have never truly bonded with Parker. You have always been too cold, too focused on your corporate risk models to be a real, nurturing mother. Now, because he is acting out at school, you are desperately fabricating this entire delusion to excuse your own maternal failure. You are losing your grip on reality. You are going crazy." I stayed perfectly still. I absorbed the gaslighting without a single defensive flinch. I let him believe his manipulation was working. I let the silence stretch out, forcing him to fill the uncomfortable void. "The paperwork was a complete mess that night," Everett finally added, waving his hand at the documents in a gesture of absolute annoyance. He was getting sloppy, annoyed that I was not breaking down in tears. The hospital records were very chaotic back then. Anyone could have made a mistake in the filing room. It means absolutely nothing. I mentally locked away the admission. He had just gone on the record confirming the hospital documentation from that night was compromised. As Everett stood up to pour himself a glass of expensive bourbon from the crystal decanter on the sideboard, a slight movement in the shadows of the hallway caught my eye. Parker was standing there, barefoot on the cold marble floor. He was partially hidden behind the grand staircase, but his eyes were wide. He had heard the entire exchange. He had heard his father frantically backpedaling, dismissing legal documents, and desperately trying to manipulate the narrative. For the very first time in his sheltered 9 years of life, the boy looked at Everett not as an invincible god, but as a man desperately scrambling to cover his own tracks. The illusion of absolute control was shattered. I did not push Everett any further. I let him take his drink and retreat into his private study, entirely convinced he had successfully neutralized my suspicions with his aggressive gaslighting. The moment his heavy door clicked shut, I picked up my phone and stopped the recording. I walked back to my home office and locked the door. I bypassed the emotional fallout entirely and shifted directly into a state of ruthless legal warfare. I contacted a highly aggressive family law attorney who specialized in high net worth divorces, emergency asset freezing, and immediate custody injunctions. We began drafting the preliminary filings right then, preparing the exact sequence of legal strikes to deploy before Everett could even realize he was under attack. But as I reviewed the scanned documents on my monitor, my risk analyst training flagged a massive vulnerability. Paperwork is powerful, but high-priced corporate defense lawyers can tie up paper evidence in endless litigation for years. They would claim forgery, clerical incompetence, or massive hospital negligence. They would drown the truth in procedural delays. If I wanted to kill this lie once and for all, I could not just rely on dead paper. I needed the people who had physically facilitated the crime. I needed the nurses who had swapped the bassinets. I needed the administrative staff who had buried the files. I needed the living, breathing accomplices who had helped my husband steal my daughter in the middle of the night. Nolan located our missing link a mere 3 days after I initiated the investigation. Her name was Erin Lott. She had been the senior charge nurse assigned to the neonatal ward during the overnight shift the exact weekend I delivered. According to the employment records Nolan excavated, she had abruptly taken an early retirement a few short months after my hospital discharge and relocated to a heavily gated, sun-bleached retirement community in Central Florida. I did not send a proxy. I did not hire a local lawyer to serve her with a subpoena. I booked a first-class commercial flight, flew down to Orlando on a Tuesday morning, and stood directly on her artificial green lawn before noon. The suffocating humidity of the southern state clung to my designer suit, but internally, I felt entirely made of ice. Nolan had bypassed the rudimentary security gate of the community with alarming ease. I walked up the short concrete driveway and pressed the illuminated doorbell. When Erin opened her pastel yellow front door, casually holding a small plastic watering can, the color instantly and completely drained from her leathery, sun-damaged face, she recognized me immediately. Guilt has an exceptional memory. "I have absolutely nothing to say to you," Erin stammered, her voice cracking as she immediately attempted to slam the heavy fiberglass door shut. I placed the flat of my palm firmly against the door panel, arresting its momentum. I did not push violently, but I held it in place with unyielding pressure. "You can invite me inside to speak in the quiet privacy of your living room, Erin, or you can speak to a federal prosecutor in a heavily televised courtroom while wearing a bright orange jumpsuit. The choice is entirely yours, but I strongly suggest you let me inside." She stepped back, her hands trembling so violently that the water inside the plastic can sloshed onto the tile floor. We sat across from each other in a dimly lit living room that smelled overwhelmingly of artificial citrus air freshener and stale cigarette smoke. I did not waste a single second with polite introductions or gentle interrogations. I opened my leather briefcase and laid the meticulously gathered evidence out onto her floral coffee table. I placed the forged voluntary relinquishment form down first, followed immediately by the undeniable, cascading financial wire transfers linking my husband directly to Darla. "Everett Sloan is currently aggressively preparing to insulate himself from a massive criminal liability," I explained, keeping my tone perfectly conversational, completely devoid of any aggressive pitch. "When the federal authorities inevitably tear this conspiracy apart, he will claim temporary emotional distress. Darla will claim complete ignorance. They are incredibly wealthy, and they have an army of corporate defense attorneys. You have a modest pension. You are the sole medical professional who physically facilitated the transfer and signed off on the fraudulent discharge. They are going to use you as the definitive, undeniable scapegoat, Erin. You will spend the remaining years of your life in a federal penitentiary for participating in the interstate trafficking of an infant." The word trafficking finally broke her fragile resolve. Erin collapsed forward, burying her face in her hands, and began to sob with a dry, hacking sound. "It was supposed to be a simple, victimless arrangement," Erin gasped, wiping her eyes with a crumpled paper tissue. "He cornered me in the staff break room on Friday afternoon. He offered me $50,000 in unmarked, untraceable cash. He told me a very convincing story. He said his wife was tragically losing her mind, that she would never psychologically bond with a sick, premature infant, and that he had privately arranged a legal, quiet adoption to save his marriage and protect the child. "Explain the exact physical mechanics to me," I demanded softly, refusing to let her hide behind her tears. Erin swallowed hard, her eyes darting nervously around the room. "It happened precisely during the shift change at 4 in the morning. The entire neonatal ward was severely understaffed due to a massive flu outbreak among the nurses. Your baby was in the standard warming bassinet in the main nursery. Darla's boy was resting 2 floors up in a private suite. Everett brought the pre-signed surrender paperwork to my desk. I simply walked into the main nursery, unclipped the plastic identification bands from both infants, and swapped them in the dark. I wheeled the boy down to your recovery room and permanently logged him under your patient profile. A sickening wave of pure nausea hit the back of my throat, but I forced it down into the dark vault of my mind. And Darla? What did she do when she physically handed over her biological son? Erin looked up, her expression twisting into one of lingering disgust and disbelief. That was the absolute coldest part of the entire horrific night. She did not shed a single tear. She did not ask to hold him one last time or kiss his forehead. She just sat up perfectly straight in her hospital bed, staring blankly at the wall, and kept asking me over and over if the boy was successfully placed in the right spot to secure the family trust fund. She treated her own newborn child like a deposited bank check. I sat back against the cheap fabric of the sofa. The massive, horrifying magnitude of Everett's sociopathy crystallized perfectly in my mind. He had never intended to build a genuine, loving life with me. I was nothing more than a convenient, respectable host. He needed the flawless facade of a highly stable marriage to appease his demanding father, and he needed a legitimate male heir to completely unlock the family fortune. My pristine social pedigree and my immaculate credit score were merely tools. I was a stepping stone, and my daughter was collateral damage. "I was terrified after the cash cleared," Erin whispered, interrupting my dark revelation. "After I completed the swap, I realized how easily a man with his resources could destroy me if the hospital ever launched an internal audit. So, before I officially shredded the original intake logs showing a female infant registered to your surgical room, I used my personal mobile phone. I took crystal clear photographs of the raw files, the original ink footprints, and the real wristbands." She stood up shakily on her feet, walked over to a locked metal filing box in the corner of the dining area, and retrieved a small encrypted digital memory drive. She walked back and placed it carefully into the palm of my hand. It was the absolute, undeniable proof of the switch. It was the lethal insurance policy she had kept hidden for nearly a decade. It was the blade that would finally sever Everett's head from his corporate empire. I returned to my home city that evening with the digital drive secured heavily inside my personal vault. The momentum of the investigation was now building into an unstoppable, crushing avalanche. Dr. Celia Marrow did not hesitate for a single moment when Nolan officially approached her legal team. After securely reviewing her own archived surgical notes, she formally signed a sworn legal affidavit. She declared under penalty of perjury that she had surgically delivered a living female infant from my body, categorically dismantling the falsified hospital narrative Everett had built. The final devastating piece of the puzzle fell into place exactly 2 days later, following my quiet, calculated intervention at Harbor House. I had to sit down with the facility director and reveal a highly sanitized, partial version of my terrifying suspicion. I framed it as a potential case of stolen identity connected to my family lineage. The administration, eager for the massive corporate scholarship trust I promised to establish, fully approved the mandated genetic profiling. I paid an exorbitant premium to the private diagnostic facility, ensuring they completely bypassed the standard 2-week waiting period. I was sitting entirely alone at my expansive dining room table when the bonded courier finally delivered the thick, sealed envelope. The grand house was entirely silent. Parker was upstairs, firmly restricted to his bedroom under my new disciplinary rules. Everett was downtown, aggressively finalizing the legal parameters of his highly anticipated legacy trust. completely oblivious to the trap closing around his throat. I picked up the heavy silver letter opener from my desk. My hands did not shake even a fraction of an inch. I sliced cleanly through the thick paper envelope and slid the single sheet of premium cardstock out onto the polished wood. My eyes deliberately bypassed the complex scientific jargon, the dense columns of genetic markers, and the laboratory methodology, dropping straight to the final, bolded conclusion printed at the very bottom of the page. The statistical probability of maternity, 99.9%. Rowan Lane was my biological daughter. I did not collapse onto the floor. I did not fall to my knees and weep hysterically at the agonizing thought of all the stolen years. I did not scream at the ornate ceiling. The profound, suffocating agony of nearly 10 lost years was too massive, too incredibly dense for something as common and fleeting as theatrical tears. Instead, I felt a terrifying, absolute stillness settle over my entire nervous system. It was the cold, highly pressurized silence that occurs right before a massive structural demolition. I picked up the piece of paper and carefully folded it exactly in half. I placed it perfectly in the center of the wooden table. I made a firm, unbreakable decision right then and there. I was not going to approach Rowan with a hysterical display of maternal grief. She was a hardened survivor, forged in a brutal system that relentlessly preyed on emotional weakness. She would absolutely despise a dramatic, weeping woman descending upon her life with sudden declarations of stolen love. She required honesty. She required a formidable partner capable of dismantling the people who had wronged her. I was going to hand her the naked, brutal truth, and together, we were going to burn the Sloan family legacy completely to the ground. I found Rowan Lane on a Saturday afternoon, exactly where the facility director said she would be. It was a cramped, poorly ventilated community bicycle repair shop situated between a defunct laundromat and a discount grocery store. The air inside tasted heavily of industrial grease, rubber cement, and metallic dust. I did not wear my usual tailored corporate blazer or expensive silk blouse. I wore a heavy wool sweater and dark denim jeans. I wanted to strip away the intimidating veneer of the wealthy benefactor. Rowan was kneeling on the oil-stained concrete floor, intensely focused on realigning the bent spokes of a mountain bike tire. Her hands were covered in dark grease. She looked up when my shadow crossed the open garage door, her sharp gray-blue eyes instantly guarded. I pulled a battered metal folding chair from the wall and sat down exactly at her eye level. I did not offer a gentle, hesitant opening. I simply handed her the thick, manila envelope containing the certified laboratory results. "I am not here to offer you another mechanical kit," I said, my voice steady over the ambient noise of a pneumatic drill running in the back of the shop. "I am here to give you the structural blueprint of your own life." Rowan wiped her dirty hands on a heavily soiled rag and took the envelope. She opened it and scanned the technical document. She did not gasp. Her hands did not tremble. She read the bolded conclusion at the bottom of the page. Absorbed the statistical certainty of our biological connection, and then slowly placed the paper onto a nearby workbench. She looked directly at me. Her face was an impenetrable fortress. "So Parker is not your son?" "No," I answered clearly. "He is the biological son of my husband, Everett, and a woman named Darla." Rowan tilted her chin up slightly. "Where did they put me?" "Everett paid a hospital nurse to swap your identification bands in the middle of the night," I explained, keeping the narrative strictly factual, entirely devoid of theatrical weeping. "He forged my legal signature on a voluntary surrender document while I was unconscious from surgical complications. You were handed over to the state foster system as an unidentified, abandoned ward." She processed the massive, devastating betrayal with the cold calculation of an engineer identifying a critical design flaw. She did not ask why they did not want her. She understood immediately that she was simply a variable in an equation that did not balance in their favor. "What do you want from me now?" Rowan asked, her tone razor-sharp. "Are you going to drag me into a massive mansion and parade me around your wealthy friends as your newly discovered tragic miracle?" "Absolutely not." I stated firmly. I am not going to force you to call me your mother. I am not going to attempt to buy the last 9 years of your life with luxury clothing or a private chauffeur. I want you to have the absolute truth. I want you to possess the power to make your own autonomous decisions regarding your future. I will burn Everett to the ground legally and financially, but your involvement in that fallout is entirely up to you. Rowan picked up a heavy steel wrench and turned it slowly in her hands. She was testing the weight of my words, searching for the hidden manipulation. Finding none, she established her absolute boundaries. I am staying at my current school, she demanded, her voice unwavering. I am staying at Harbor House for now. I am not moving into your house. I refuse to be a symbol of pity for anyone, and if I need you to back off and give me space, you walk away without an argument. Agreed, I said instantly. I did not feel rejected. I felt a profound, overwhelming surge of pride. She was setting terms like a seasoned negotiator. She was undeniably mine. Our relationship did not begin with dramatic, tearful embraces or cliché declarations of missing each other. It began with a quiet, mutual respect. Over the next week, I met her at the repair shop. We did not discuss the lost years. We discussed gear ratios, hydraulic pressure, and the tensile strength of steel cables. We visited a local university open science workshop and examined dismantled motorcycle engines. I learned exactly how she thought, how she meticulously deconstructed complex problems, and she learned that my presence was a consistent, non-demanding constant in her previously chaotic reality. While the foundation with my daughter was being built on solid concrete, the atmosphere back at my sprawling estate was rapidly fracturing. The strict disciplinary lockdown I had imposed on Parker was finally breaking through his arrogant exterior. The absolute silence of the house, combined with the sudden, glaring absence of Everett, was tearing down his carefully constructed illusions. Everett had been spending every waking hour downtown, frantically preparing the financial presentations for the upcoming Legacy Summit, completely abandoning the boy to my cold authority. Late one evening, I was sitting at the kitchen island reviewing a thick stack of asset freezing injunctions prepared by my legal team. Parker walked slowly into the kitchen. He looked physically exhausted. The manufactured bravado of the wealthy bully was entirely gone, leaving behind a confused, deeply anxious 9-year-old boy. He stood across the marble counter, staring blankly at a bowl of fruit. "Does Dad actually care about anyone besides himself?" he asked. His voice was incredibly small, completely devoid of the sharp sneer he usually employed. I stopped reading the legal brief. I looked at the boy. It would have been incredibly easy to lie to him, to offer a comforting platitude about complicated adult emotions. But I had promised myself I was entirely done with lies. "Your father views people as strategic assets, Parker," I said, my voice calm and completely stripped of malice. "He calculates what a person can provide for him: financial security, public reputation, or control over a family dynasty. When you stop providing value, he stops seeing you." Parker swallowed hard, his eyes dropping to the floor. "He is using me too, is he not?" "Yes," I confirmed bluntly. "You are a victim of the people who brought you into this world. They engineered your entire existence to secure a massive inheritance, but being a victim of their manipulation does not excuse the choices you made on your own." He looked up, genuinely startled by the harsh pivot. "You chose to systematically target Rowan Lane," I continued, holding his gaze relentlessly. "You used the power and the money your father provided to crush a girl who had absolutely nothing. You became the exact monster he trained you to be. You do not get a free pass for cruelty just because you are a pawn on his chessboard." The raw, unfiltered truth hit him like a physical blow. He did not yell. He did not throw a teshuvah. He simply stood there, absorbing the crushing reality that the luxurious universe he inhabited was built on a foundation of absolute rot, and that he was actively participating in the decay. He turned without saying another word and walked slowly back up the grand staircase. I thought the conversation was completely over. I returned my attention to the complex legal documents, mentally preparing for the brutal corporate warfare that was about to erupt at the coastal estate in Georgia. But 10 minutes later, Parker returned to the kitchen. He did not speak. He walked directly up to the edge of the marble island and placed a small black digital voice recorder onto the surface. It was a high-end device Everett often used to dictate corporate memos while driving. Parker slid it across the smooth stone toward me. "He left it in his study," Parker whispered, his voice trembling slightly. I listened to it. He was talking to Aunt Darla on the phone. Parker turned and ran out of the kitchen before I could ask a single question. I picked up the heavy device. My thumb rested over the play button. I pressed it down, and the crystal-clear audio file filled the quiet kitchen. It was Everett's voice, smooth, confident, and dripping with arrogant impatience. "You need to stay perfectly calm, Darla," Everett commanded through the speaker. "Maddie is entirely neutralized. She is chasing ghosts and getting emotional over clerical errors. Just keep Parker happy and quiet for another week. Once we get through Legacy Weekend, once the board signs the final proxy documents and officially names the boy as the primary generational beneficiary, we are completely untouchable. The old man will step down, and everything in the Sloan family will be yours and mine." I stopped the recording. The silence in the house was absolute. Parker had not just given me an eavesdropped conversation. He had handed me a fully recorded, legally admissible confession of premeditated financial fraud and conspiracy. He had delivered the final, fatal weapon right into my hands. Everett believed he was holding all the cards, preparing to walk into the grandest celebration of his life. He had no idea I was bringing a loaded arsenal to the party. The trap was perfectly set, and I was going to snap it shut with the entire world watching. Everett firmly believed I would never actually detonate the bomb, 2 days before we were scheduled to leave for the coastal estate. He cornered me in the grand foyer of our home and attempted to force me into a silent agreement. He did not yell. He used his smoothest, most reasonable tone, the one he reserved for hostile corporate takeovers. He explicitly threatened my professional reputation. He reminded me that as a senior risk analyst, my entire career was built on the foundation of stability, sound judgment, and public trust. He coldly calculated that if I exposed his massive, convoluted crime, the media frenzy would inevitably drag me through the mud as well. The press would dissect me, labeling me a hysterical, neglectful mother who had somehow lost her own child in a hospital ward. He assumed my immense pride and my fear of public humiliation would keep me perfectly compliant. I looked directly into his calculating eyes, offered a slow, defeated nod, and agreed to attend the family summit. Everett smiled, entirely convinced he had successfully managed the crisis. He thought he had contained me inside a cage of fear and social dignity, while my husband confidently packed his bespoke linen suits and practiced his victory speeches. I finalized a very different kind of itinerary, operating out of a highly secure, encrypted digital server, Nolan, my aggressive family law attorney, and I assembled the ultimate battle dossier. We digitized every single piece of lethal evidence. We uploaded the high-resolution photographs of the original hospital footprints provided by the retired nurse, Erin Lott. We attached the sworn legal affidavit from Dr. Celia Marrow. We scanned the certified laboratory documents proving a 99.9% biological match between myself and Rowan. Finally, we embedded the crystal-clear audio file of Everett confessing his entire fraudulent scheme. My legal team meticulously mapped out an automated digital distribution grid, the exact moment I gave the final authorization. The entire encrypted package would simultaneously transmit to the Federal Bureau of Investigation, the State Medical Licensing Board, the Internal Revenue Service, and 5 major investigative journalism outlets. I made a deliberate, unbreakable decision to leave Rowan back in the city. At one point, my legal counsel had gently suggested bringing the girl to the southern estate to maximize the sheer emotional shock value of the revelation. I shut the strategy down immediately. I absolutely refused to turn my biological daughter into a theatrical prop. She was not a tool to be paraded in front of a crowd of curious, gaping billionaires to elicit sympathetic gasps. She was a hardened, brilliant survivor, and I was going to protect her from the toxic, chaotic blast zone I was preparing to create. She stayed securely at Harbor House, working on her mechanical projects, entirely insulated from the grotesque circus of the upper class. We flew down to Georgia on a private jet on Friday afternoon. The Sloan family estate was a staggering, overwhelming monument to generational wealth. It spanned over 300 acres of pristine, manicured beachfront property. Massive oak trees draped in heavy Spanish moss lined the winding driveway, leading up to a sprawling, historic mansion that looked more like a fortress than a home. The air was thick with humidity and the overwhelming scent of expensive floral arrangements. Everywhere I looked, catering staff in crisp white uniforms carried silver trays of imported champagne and caviar. When Parker emerged from his massive guest suite on Saturday evening, the psychological toll of the last few weeks was visibly crushing him. He was dressed in a custom-tailored, charcoal gray suit with a crisp silk tie. He looked exactly like a miniature corporate executive. But the arrogant, cruel swagger he usually carried was completely gone. His face was pale, his eyes wide and anxious. He stood awkwardly in the center of the grand ballroom, surrounded by towering crystal chandeliers and wealthy relatives who constantly patted his shoulder and pinched his cheeks. He finally understood the brutal reality I had outlined for him back in our kitchen. He realized he was not a beloved son. He was simply a living, breathing logo. He was a biological key engineered by his father and his secret mother to unlock a massive financial vault. The sheer weight of that realization made him look incredibly small and profoundly terrified. During the pre-dinner cocktail hour, the tension beneath the opulent surface was thick enough to slice with a knife. Everett was in his absolute element, completely oblivious to the trap I had laid directly beneath his feet. He stood near the grand mahogany bar, holding a heavy glass of expensive whiskey, holding court with a circle of senior board members and venture capitalists. I stood silently at his side, flawlessly playing the role of the subdued, supportive wife. When one of the elderly board members expressed a minor concern about some negative public rumors regarding their latest real estate acquisition, Everett let out a smooth, practiced laugh. He took a slow sip of his whiskey and leaned forward. "You are worrying about the wrong metrics, Richard," Everett declared loudly, his voice echoing over the gentle hum of the string quartet playing in the background. "It absolutely does not matter what the actual numbers say, and it does not matter what the truth is. Perception beats truth every single time. If you control the narrative, you completely control the reality. The public will blindly believe whatever grand, confident story you present to them. You just have to sell the image." He casually glanced at me out of the corner of his eye as he spoke the words. A smug, victorious smirk played on his lips. He was directly mocking me. He was arrogant enough to believe his manufactured reality had successfully crushed my truth. He had absolutely no idea that his arrogant philosophy was actively pumping highly volatile fuel directly into my cold resolve. He also had absolutely no idea that while he was boasting about controlling the narrative, Nolan was standing completely undetected in the shadows of the secondary control booth located behind the main outdoor pavilion. My private investigator had paid an exorbitant sum of untraceable cash to the freelance audio-visual technician to simply walk away and take an early dinner break. Nolan had systematically hijacked the primary presentation feed for the entire estate. Every single high-definition screen suspended around the pavilion, every single surround sound speaker, and the massive digital projector aimed at the main stage were now directly routed to the secure external server holding my digital dossier. The grand gala dinner commenced precisely at 8 o'clock in the evening. 400 elite guests, dressed in designer gowns and expensive tuxedos, took their assigned seats under the massive outdoor pavilion. The structure was illuminated by thousands of tiny, suspended lights that mimicked a starry night sky. Waiters poured vintage wine, and the low, wealthy murmur of the crowd filled the warm night air. At exactly 9 o'clock, The ambient music slowly faded into silence. Conrad Sloane, the aging, formidable patriarch of the family dynasty, walked heavily up the carpeted stairs to the central stage. He adjusted the microphone, the feedback whining briefly before settling. The sprawling crowd fell into an immediate, respectful hush. Everett sat in the chair directly next to mine. He was vibrating with unconcealed, predatory excitement. He leaned forward, his eyes fixed intensely on his father. This was the exact moment his $80 million gambit was finally going to pay off. The decades of lies, the forged documents, the midnight hospital swap, and the secret financial accounts were all about to be permanently validated by the stroke of a pen. Conrad Sloane cleared his throat, his deep voice projecting perfectly across the manicured lawn. He spoke highly of tradition, of corporate responsibility, and of the sacred, unbreakable bonds of family lineage. He signaled to a waiter, who handed him a crystal flute filled with champagne. "We are not just transferring wealth tonight," Conrad announced, raising the glass high into the air, the lights catching the bubbling liquid. "We are securing the very future of this dynasty. We are passing the torch to the next generation." I raised my glass to the young boy sitting at the front table, to the grandson who will carry the pure Sloane bloodline further and higher than ever before. The crowd immediately began to clap, a wave of polite, wealthy applause rolling toward our table. Everett beamed, turning his head to look at Parker, ready to push the boy to his feet. I did not clap. I sat perfectly still in my chair, hidden completely out of sight inside my small, black velvet evening clutch was a tiny, wireless remote control. It consisted of a single, highly sensitive button synced directly to Nolan's hijacked server. I rested my thumb gently against the cool plastic surface. Everett thought he controlled the entire reality of the room, but my thumb was currently resting on the detonator that was about to blow his entire universe into a million unrecoverable pieces. Conrad Sloane stood at the center of the illuminated stage, holding the heavy crystal symbol of the family trust. He looked out over the sea of 400 elite guests, his chest puffed out with generational pride. He opened his mouth to officially call Parker up to the podium. I stood up from my chair. The movement was entirely smooth, devoid of any frantic energy. I did not scream. I did not throw my glass. True power never needs to raise its voice. I pitched my tone to cut cleanly through the humid night air, ensuring it carried all the way to the stage. "Before you celebrate legacy, you should verify parentage," I said. The immediate silence that fell over the massive pavilion was absolute. Conrad frowned, lowering the crystal trophy. Everett snapped his head toward me, his arrogant smile freezing into a mask of sudden confusion. I pressed my thumb down on the small wireless remote hidden inside my velvet clutch. Behind Conrad, the massive high-definition presentation screens spanning the length of the stage flickered. The carefully curated montage of the Sloane family history vanished. In its place, the towering screens illuminated the night with a blinding white light, displaying my digital dossier in perfect high-contrast resolution. First, the medical note from my 20-week ultrasound appeared. The words "healthy female fetus" magnified to the size of a luxury vehicle. Then, the screen transitioned to the forged voluntary relinquishment form, followed instantly by Darla Vance's cash admission receipt to the maternity ward. Next came the sworn, signed affidavits from Nurse Erin Lott and Dr. Celia Marrow, detailing the exact mechanics of the midnight swap. Finally, the screens displayed the certified laboratory document, the bold black letters declaring a 99.9% probability of maternity between myself and Rowan Lane. A collective gasp rippled through the hundreds of wealthy attendees. The soft clinking of silverware stopped completely. Everett leapt from his chair, knocking his crystal wineglass onto the manicured grass. "Turn that off," he roared, his perfectly crafted public persona completely shattering. He pointed a shaking finger at me. "She is completely insane. This is a psychotic break. These are fabricated documents, deep fakes created by a bitter, unstable woman I did not waste my breath arguing with a cornered narcissist. I simply pressed the button a second time. The ambient string music abruptly cut out from the surround sound speakers hidden throughout the pavilion. A second later, Everett's own voice blasted over the high-fidelity audio system. The recording Parker had captured in the study echoed across the sprawling estate. Everyone heard Everett explicitly instructing Darla to stay calm, detailing how he had neutralized my suspicions, and gloating about his plan to keep Parker quiet just long enough to secure the $80 million trust fund. Everett froze entirely, his face draining of all blood. He looked like a man who had just stepped on a landmine and heard the click. But the most devastating blow did not come from my digital evidence. It came from the 9-year-old boy sitting at the head table. The crushing weight of the sudden, massive public exposure broke Parker completely. He was hyperventilating, his small chest heaving under his tailored suit. He looked at the hundreds of horrified faces staring at him. And then he looked at his father, who was desperately trying to signal the security guards. "You told me to lie," Parker screamed, his voice cracking with pure, unadulterated childish panic. He backed away from the table, tears streaming down his face. "You told me I had to pretend. You said Aunt Darla was my real mom in secret, and that we just had to wait until today to take the money you said we would win." The entire pavilion erupted into total chaos. Conrad Sloan dropped the microphone. The sharp screech of electronic feedback pierced the air as the heavy microphone struck the wooden stage. The aging patriarch looked at his son not with familial disappointment, but with the cold, terrified realization of a chief executive officer staring at a catastrophic legal liability. Conrad instantly understood that this massive premeditated fraud could completely unravel the business agreements of the entire Sloan empire, subjecting the family to brutal federal investigations and crippling civil lawsuits. Before Everett could even attempt to physically grab Parker and drag him away, the heavy oak doors at the back of the pavilion swung violently open. Nolan marched down the center aisle, flanked by 2 armed federal investigators and my lead corporate attorney, Darla, who had been hiding at a secondary table near the back, let out a piercing shriek and broke down instantly. She began loudly begging the agents for a plea deal before they even reached her, confessing to everything in a desperate bid to save herself. Everett collapsed back into his chair, covering his face with his hands, his $80 million empire evaporating into the humid Georgia air. I turned my back on the stage. I walked calmly toward the exit. I did not call Rowan out from the shadows to join me under the flashing lights. I did not force her onto a stage to publicly embrace me and weep for the tabloid reporters. I absolutely refused to let the ravenous media swallow my child whole. That is the fundamental difference between executing true justice and staging an emotional performance. The legal aftermath over the next 6 months was an absolute bloodbath. Everett and Darla faced a massive cascade of federal and state indictments, including the forgery of official medical records, criminal conspiracy to interfere with child custody, and aggravated identity fraud. To protect the remaining corporate assets from federal seizure, the Sloan family legally severed Everett from the dynasty completely, leaving him to face the crushing weight of the criminal justice system entirely alone and entirely bankrupt. Rowan did not immediately pack her bags and move into my sprawling suburban house. The trauma of 9 stolen years cannot be erased by a court victory or a change of address. She chose her own deliberate rhythm. She remained at Harbor House during the school week, continuing her classes on her own terms, and spent her weekends at my estate. We spent our time in the large garage, attending specialized mechanical workshops, and engaging in slow, quiet conversations that carried no heavy expectations. I respected every single inch of the physical and emotional distance she required. On a warm Saturday afternoon in late May, we were standing in my driveway, looking down at the exposed engine block of a rusted, 20-year-old riding lawnmower we had salvaged from a local scrapyard. Smudges of dark engine grease stained the sleeves of her shirt. She silently examined the corroded carburetor for a long moment. Then, she extended her left hand toward me without looking up. "Hand me the wrench," she said simply. I reached into the metal toolbox and placed the heavy steel tool directly into her palm. It was the most mundane, ordinary request in the world, but as I watched her tighten the bolt, a profound sense of peace finally settled over my entire soul. It was a victory worth infinitely more than the flawless destruction of the Sloan legacy, because for the very first time in a decade, the future had finally opened its mouth and invited me to step inside. Thank you so much for listening to this story to the very end. Please leave a comment letting me know where in the world you are listening from so we can connect and share our thoughts together. Do not forget to subscribe to the Olivia Revenge Stories channel. Like this video, and show your support by hitting the hype button so this story can be heard by even more people.